In the Arizona Territory, the year is 1887. The dust on the porch hadn't even settled from the Marshals' boots when Ezra Blackwood realized his entire world, everything he'd built for 2 years, was a lie. 3 men with silver badges stood there, their faces hard as the desert rock. They weren't asking about cattle rustlers or bandits. They were asking for a woman named Catherine Morrison, but they called her by another name too, a name whispered in saloons and printed in dime novels, Black Widow Kate. And the woman they were describing, the woman they said was a cold-blooded killer who married men just to put them in the ground, was the same woman who'd been sleeping beside him for 2 years, the same woman who called herself Mary Sullivan, the same woman who made the finest apple pie in all of Tucson County, and who sang sweet hymns while she hung the laundry out to dry, the same woman whose kiss could make a man forget every trouble he ever had, the same woman whose gentle hands he now realized had never once trembled. It all started 2 summers before, in 1885. Ezra Blackwood was a man who knew the land. At 28, he'd wrestled a living from the harsh Arizona soil, building a modest ranch that was sturdy, solid, but painfully empty. The loneliness was a constant companion, a dry cough in the back of his soul. Then, one day, he looked up from his work, and she was there, standing at his gate like a mirage shimmering in the heat. She wore a faded blue calico dress, tired and worn, and a bonnet that had seen far too many miles. Her brown hair, escaping the bonnet, caught the sun like threads of polished wood. When she lifted her face to speak, Ezra felt his heart do a funny little jump, like a flat stone skipping across a calm pond. "Pardon me, sir," she said. Her voice was soft, gentle, like the first rain after a long, dry spell. "I'm looking for work, any kind of work. I can cook, clean, tend to the livestock. I don't eat much, and I promise I'm a hard worker." She told him her name was Mary Sullivan. She said she came from Kansas, that fever had taken her whole family, and she was just looking for a fresh start out west. Ezra looked into her eyes. They were green, the color of moss in a shady creek, but they seemed to hold back a whole world of secrets. Then again, who didn't come west carrying secrets? Everyone was running from something. "I can't pay much," Ezra heard himself say, the words coming out before he'd even thought them through. "I don't need much," she replied, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. "Just a roof over my head and some honest work." And just like that, she came into his life. That first evening, she moved around his dusty, neglected kitchen with a quiet, practiced grace. She handled his old cook stove like she'd been born to it, and soon the house was filled with the smell of fresh bread, a smell Ezra hadn't known in years. It smelled like a home. He sat at his small wooden table, watching her, a strange feeling stirring in his chest. "You cook like this back in Kansas?" he asked, trying to make conversation. For a split second, something flickered across her face. A shadow, quick as a hummingbird's wing. Then it was gone. "My mama taught me," she said, her voice quiet. Before she passed. The way she said it, with a finality as sharp as a closing door, told him not to ask any more questions. Ezra understood. The West was full of folks who preferred to let their past lie buried deep in the ground. So he let it be. Over the next few months, Mary Sullivan didn't just work for Ezra. She transformed his world. She planted a vegetable garden that burst with life, its green shoots a miracle in the dry soil. She mended his worn-out clothes until they looked almost new. She filled the suffocating silence of the ranch house with her gentle humming and soft singing. But more than that, she filled the gaping, lonely hole in Ezra's heart. By the time the desert air started to turn crisp in the autumn, Ezra found himself hurrying back from the fields each day, his heart beating a little faster, just for the chance to see her smile. Mary had a way of turning the mundane into something magical. She'd place a jar of wildflowers on the dinner table. She'd sit on the porch in the cool evenings, reading to him from whatever books the traveling merchant brought through town. Her voice would rise and fall with the words, painting pictures in the twilight. "You're educated," Ezra noted one evening, after she'd finished a passage from some poet he'd never heard of. "Some," she said, her eyes on the page. "Reading helps pass the time." He'd never met anyone like her. She was a puzzle of contradictions. She could help birth a calf with the calm competence of a seasoned ranch hand, yet she could also recite poetry that would make a preacher weep. He saw her shoot a rattlesnake once, from 20 paces, a clean shot right through the head. But whenever he saw her near his rifle after that, she looked uncomfortable, like she was holding something she despised. These little mysteries didn't scare him. They drew him in. They made Mary Sullivan the most fascinating person he'd ever known. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset bleed across the sky in brilliant strokes of red and gold, Ezra decided he couldn't bear the thought of ever going back to the way things were before her. "Mary," he said, his voice a little rough. She turned to him, her green eyes questioning in the fading light. "I've been thinking," he said, his palms suddenly sweaty. "A man gets mighty lonely out here, and I figure a woman probably does too." Her hands, which had been busy with some mending, stilled in her lap. She looked at him, a slow understanding dawning on her face. "Ezra Blackwood," she said softly. "Are you asking what I think you're asking?" "I suppose I am," he mumbled, feeling as nervous as a schoolboy. "I know we haven't known each other all that long, but... well, I've grown mighty fond of you, Mary. You've made this place. You've made it feel like home again." For a long, long moment, she didn't say anything. She just stared out at the horizon, at the last sliver of sun disappearing behind the mountains. Ezra's heart hammered against his ribs. He thought he'd made a terrible mistake. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. "I've got a past, Ezra. A past I'm not proud of." "We all do," he said, his voice finding its strength. "Out here, all that matters is who you are now, not who you were before." She turned and studied his face, her own etched with an emotion he couldn't quite read. "You're a good man, Ezra Blackwood," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "A better man than I deserve." A flicker of hope ignited in his chest. Is that a yes? And then he saw it. A genuine smile, slow and beautiful, spreading across her face. It was like watching the sun rise. "That's a yes," she said. They were married on a cold November morning in 1885. The only witnesses were the local preacher and his wife. Mary wore a simple green dress she'd sewn herself, and as she stood before him, Ezra thought he had never seen anything so beautiful in his entire life. The ceremony was short, the words simple, but when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Ezra felt a profound, bone-deep joy, as if he'd been handed the keys to heaven itself. When Mary, his Mary, now Mary Blackwood, kissed him, it was with a tenderness so pure and deep that he forgot all about the harsh desert wind whipping around the small church. He forgot about the loneliness, the hardship, the silence. All he knew was the warmth of her lips and the promise of a future. Their first year of marriage was a dream. It passed in a blur of contented days and peaceful nights. Mary was everything a man could ever pray for in a wife. She kept the house immaculate. She cooked meals that were the envy of the county. And she shared his bed with a warmth and passion that often left them both breathless. Ezra had never known such happiness was possible, but even in paradise, there were shadows. Every now and then, he'd see a flicker of the old Mary, the stranger from Kansas. A sudden noise, like a horse riding up too fast, would make her freeze, her body going rigid. He'd catch her staring out at the horizon, her eyes scanning the empty plains as if she was watching for someone, waiting for someone. One afternoon, he walked into the bedroom and found her cleaning a small pearl-handled pistol. a gun he'd never seen before. She kept it hidden away in the bottom of her sewing basket. When she saw him, she didn't flinch. "Protection," she said simply, her voice even. "A woman alone learns to be careful." "You're not alone anymore, Mary," he said gently, coming to stand behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist. He felt her lean back against him, a soft sigh escaping her lips. "No," she agreed, her voice soft as she tucked the little gun away. "I'm not." But she kept the gun. The second year came, and with it, talk of children. They hoped, they prayed, but Mary's belly remained stubbornly flat. Ezra told her it didn't matter. He told her he had all he needed right here. He had his wife, his ranch, and a life so full of quiet joy it felt like a miracle. They'd sit on the porch in the evenings, the desert air cooling around them, and make plans. They'd expand the house. They'd buy more livestock. Their dreams were simple, humble, and shared. "What do you think about getting into cattle?" Ezra asked her one evening in the spring of 1887. She laughed, a sound that was like music to him. "I think they're smelly and stubborn," she replied, leaning her head against his shoulder. "But profitable." She squeezed his arm. "You do what you think is best, husband. I trust your judgment." "I trust your judgment." It was moments like that, moments of simple, perfect trust, that made Ezra feel like the luckiest man in the entire Arizona territory. His wife, his beautiful, capable Mary, loved him. She trusted him. She had taken his bachelor's shack and turned it into a sanctuary. His empty life was now a thing worth living. If only he had known. If only he had understood that the entire beautiful thing was built on a foundation of lies and secrets, ready to crumble into dust at any moment. He was living in a dream, and the waking was going to be brutal. The first real crack in their perfect world appeared on a hot June morning. Ezra had just come back from town and tossed the latest newspaper onto the kitchen table. He was pouring himself a cup of coffee when he noticed Mary staring at the paper. Her face had gone white as a sheet. All the color had drained right out of her. "Something wrong, honey?" he asked, walking over to her. She folded the paper in a flash, her movements jerky and quick. "No, nothing important," she said, her voice a little too high. Just reading about the weather reports." But Ezra had seen the headline she'd been staring at. He'd seen the bold black letters. "Notorious outlaw gang strikes again in New Mexico." It seemed an odd thing to get so worked up about. Later that day, he went to look for the paper, thinking he'd read the article himself. He couldn't find it anywhere. Finally, he checked the stove. Inside, among the ashes, he found the charred remains of the front page. She had burned it. A week after that, something else happened. Ezra woke up in the middle of the night. The bed beside him was empty. A sliver of moonlight cut through the window, and in its pale glow, he saw Mary. She was standing at the window, perfectly still, just staring out into the moon-drenched desert. She looked like a statue. He got up quietly and went to her. "Can't sleep?" he whispered. She jumped, a small, sharp gasp escaping her lips. She spun around, her eyes wide and wild with a panic he'd never seen before. For a terrifying second, it was like she didn't recognize him. Then her body sagged with relief. "Oh, Ezra, you startled me. Are you all right?" "Bad dreams," she said, letting him lead her back to the bed. "Something like that." But as she lay beside him, he could feel the tension humming through her body. She was as rigid as a fence post, and he knew she didn't sleep again until the first light of dawn broke over the horizon. The strange incidents started to pile up, like stones on a grave. Mary began making more and more trips into town. She'd claim she needed supplies that Ezra knew for a fact they already had plenty of, and she started carrying that little pistol of hers, not hidden in her sewing basket, but strapped to her hip, open and bold, like a gunfighter. When he finally asked her about it, she had a ready answer. Saw some coyote tracks near the chicken coop, she said, not looking at him. Since when do you need a gun for a coyote? Ezra pressed, a knot of unease tightening in his gut. Since I decided I don't like losing chickens, she'd snapped back, her voice sharp. And her eyes, those beautiful green eyes, refused to meet his. The biggest change, the one that worried him the most, was in their conversations. Mary, who used to love talking about their future, about the children they'd have and the life they'd build, started to shy away from any talk that went beyond the next few weeks. She lived only in the present. One day, Ezra mentioned that he'd like to visit her hometown in Kansas someday, see where she grew up. Her face closed off completely. There's nothing left there worth seeing, Ezra. No friends? No family graves you'd want to visit? The past is the past, Ezra, she said, and her voice was cold, like a winter wind. It's best to leave it buried. But Ezra was starting to get a sick, terrifying feeling, a feeling that Mary's past wasn't buried at all. It was walking toward them, and it was coming fast. Everything came to a head on a scorching morning in July of 1887. The air was still and heavy, promising a brutally hot day. Ezra was out mending a stretch of fence on the far side of his property when he saw it, a dust cloud rising up from the east. 3 riders, moving with a steady, relentless purpose. They weren't cowboys, they weren't drifters. They rode with an authority that made the hairs on Ezra's arms stand up. As they got closer, he saw the sun glint off something on their chests. Silver badges. U.S. Marshals. A cold dread washed over him. He turned and looked toward the house. Mary must have seen them too. She was standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed against the dark interior. She had taken off her apron. Her hair was tied back neat and tight, and the pearl-handled pistol was strapped to her hip. Her face was a mask, not of fear, not of panic. It was a mask of pure, cold resignation, as if this was a day she had been expecting her entire life. "Ezra!" she called out, and her voice was shockingly steady. It carried across the distance between them, clear and calm. "Come inside, now." "What's this about, Mary?" he asked, as he hurried toward the house, his heart starting to pound a frantic rhythm against his ribs. But she didn't answer. She just disappeared back into the shadows of the house, leaving him alone to face the approaching lawmen. The 3 marshals reined in their horses right at his gate. The leader, a weathered man with steel-gray hair and eyes that looked like they'd seen everything, dismounted. He walked toward the porch with a slow, deliberate stride. His 2 companions stayed on their horses, their hands resting casually, unnervingly, near their holstered guns. "Mr. Blackwood?" the leader asked, his voice gravelly. "That's right. I'm Marshal Tom Henderson. We're looking for a woman. We have reason to believe she might be staying here with you." He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "Goes by the name of Catherine Morrison, though she's been known to use a whole mess of other names." Ezra's mouth went bone dry. Catherine Morrison. Not Mary Sullivan, not Mary Blackwood. The name was alien, foreign. I don't know anyone by that name," he managed to say, his own voice sounding strange to his ears. Marshal Henderson's eyes narrowed, sharp and piercing. "She's about 25 years old. Brown hair, green eyes, a real pretty woman. Probably told you some sob story about being from Kansas or maybe Missouri. Family died of fever, something like that." Every word was a hammer blow. The description matched his wife, his Mary. It matched her perfectly. But Ezra shook his head, a desperate denial rising in his throat. "I'm sorry, Marshal. You've made a mistake. There's no one like that here. Can't help you." The Marshal's face was grim. He took a step closer, his voice dropping low. "Mr. Blackwood, this isn't a social call. This woman, Catherine Morrison, she's wanted for murder, multiple murders." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. "Her victims," Henderson continued, his eyes locked on Ezra's, "were all men. Men she married or got herself involved with. She'd gained their trust. maybe even their love. Then she'd kill them for their money, their property, whatever they had. He paused, letting the horrific words sink in. That's why we call her Black Widow Kate. Black Widow Kate. The name echoed in Ezra's mind. He'd heard it before, whispered in saloons, read about it in those sensational newspapers he'd seen in town. A ghost story, a legend about a beautiful, deadly woman who seduced men and left a trail of graves behind her. A monster in the shape of an angel. It couldn't be. It was impossible. It was a lie. You're certain she's not here? Henderson pressed, his hand drifting down, coming to rest on the butt of his pistol. And that's when a voice came from the doorway. Marshal Henderson. It was Mary. His Mary. All three lawmen turned as she stepped out onto the porch, into the harsh sunlight. Her hands were held out to her sides, open and empty. She looked completely calm, serene even, as if she were greeting old friends. Marshal Henderson let out a breath, a soft hiss of air. Kate Morrison, he breathed, his own hand tightening on his gun. You're under arrest for the murders of James Hartley, William Fisher, David Crenshaw, and Robert Kellerman. Kate, his Mary, just nodded slowly, as if she were merely confirming a dinner invitation. I know why you're here, she said. No! Ezra finally found his voice. He lurched forward, stepping between his wife and the marshal. No! There's been a mistake! A terrible mistake! This is my wife! This is Mary! Mary Blackwood! We've been married for almost 2 years! He turned to his wife, his eyes begging her, pleading with her. Tell them, Mary. Tell them it's a lie. Marshal Henderson's weathered face softened with something that looked almost like pity. Son, he said, his voice gentle but firm. This woman, she's been married 6 times in the past 5 years. Every single one of her husbands ended up dead under very suspicious circumstances. That's impossible, Ezra whispered, but the fight was draining out of him. The conviction in his voice was gone, replaced by a dawning, soul-crushing horror. All the pieces were suddenly slamming into place. Her secrecy about her past, her skill with that hidden pistol, the way she would freeze at a sudden sound, the way she was always watching, always waiting, the burned newspaper, the midnight vigils. It wasn't caution. It was guilt. Ezra, Kate said, her voice quiet but clear. He turned to face her, the woman he loved, the woman he thought he knew. Ezra, she said again, her green eyes meeting his, and in them he saw no denial, only a deep, bottomless sadness. It's true. The marshal's words still hung in the hot, dead air. 6 times in the past 5 years, all dead. Ezra stared at the woman he had called his wife, searching her face, desperately searching for some sign, any sign, that this was all a nightmare, a horrible, cruel mistake. Tell me it's not true, he whispered, his voice cracking. Mary, please. For the first time, her composure seemed to waver. Her beautiful green eyes filled with something that looked like tears. I can't do that, Ezra. Marshal Henderson took a step forward, his hand still resting on his gun. Mrs. Morrison, you need to come with us. Now. I know, Kate said, her voice steady again, resigned. I will. But first, I owe my husband an explanation. She looked at the marshal. Please, he deserves that much. Kate, Henderson began, impatient. 5 minutes, she pleaded, her voice soft but insistent. That's all I ask. 5 minutes. The marshal glanced at his deputies, who sat on their horses like stone statues. He let out a heavy sigh, then gave a curt nod. 5 minutes, but we're staying right here. Kate turned to Ezra, and for a fleeting moment she looked just like the Mary he had married, vulnerable, beautiful, tragically human. Can we sit? She asked. Numbly, Ezra followed her to the porch steps and sat down on the rough wood. The world felt unreal, like a poorly staged play. The Marshals stood nearby, their presence a heavy, suffocating weight, watching their every move. "My real name," she began, her voice low, "is Catherine Elizabeth Morrison. I was born in Missouri, not Kansas." She stared out at the dusty yard, at the life they had built together. A life that was now a crime scene. "My father, he was a drunk. My mother died when I was 12. I learned something very early on, Ezra. I learned that men could be cruel, and that sometimes, for a woman to survive, she had to be crueler." Ezra listened, his body numb, his mind reeling in horror as she continued to speak. "I married my first husband when I was just 16. His name was Thomas Brennan. He was kind at first, sweet, just like you." She glanced at him, her eyes full of a pain so deep it seemed to have no bottom. "But after the wedding, he changed. He drank. He hit me. He did things to me." Her voice cracked, just for a second. "One night, he came home drunker and meaner than ever. I knew what was coming. I couldn't take it anymore." She took a deep, shuddering breath. "So I put arsenic in his whiskey, enough to kill a horse." "Kate," Ezra whispered her new name. It felt like poison on his tongue. "No one ever suspected a thing," she went on, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. "I was just the poor, grieving young widow. Thomas, he left me his farm. It wasn't much, but it was something. I sold it, and I moved on. I told myself it was justice. I told myself he deserved it. And maybe he did." She paused, then turned to look at him directly. "But then I met James Hartley." She confessed everything. Each name was another nail in the coffin of the woman he thought he knew. James Hartley, a wealthy merchant from Denver who beat his servants. William Fisher, a rancher who, she'd heard, had driven his previous wife to her death. David Crenshaw, a gambler and a cheat who robbed travelers on the road. Robert Kellerman, a man with power and money who used it to force himself on the young girls who worked for him. "They were all bad men, Ezra," she said, her voice rising with a strange, fierce energy. "They were monsters who hid behind respectable faces. They were men who deserved every single thing they got." Her eyes burned with a righteous fire, but then it flickered and died. "But I won't lie to you. It wasn't just about justice. Their money, it helped me survive. It gave me freedom. I told myself I was doing the world a favor while I was lining my pockets." The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy. Ezra finally found the strength to ask the one question that was screaming in his mind, the question that felt like a knife twisting in his gut. "And me?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "What about me? Was I supposed to be next?" At that, her composure finally shattered. The mask of calm resignation fell away, and raw, agonizing grief took its place. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot and fast, as she reached for his hand. He flinched away from her touch, as if her skin were fire. "No," she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "No, Ezra. Never you." He just stared at her, his heart a cold, dead weight in his chest. "You're different," she insisted, her words tumbling out in a desperate rush. "You're a good man. You're kind. You never once raised your hand to me. You never even spoke a harsh word. For the first time in my entire life with you, I felt safe. I felt loved. But you were going to kill me," he said, the words flat and lifeless. "You were planning it." "No!" The word was a raw scream of denial. "I mean, yes, at first. I meant to." The confession tore from her lips. "That's why I came here. I'd heard about you. A young widower with a successful ranch. You were supposed to be easy money, another name on the list." She looked at him, her eyes pleading for him to understand. "But then I got to know you. I saw the man you were, and Ezra, I fell in love with you. Real love. Not the pretend kind I used to trap the others. Not a lie. It was the only real thing in my life. How could he believe her? How could he believe a single word that came out of her mouth? This woman, who had lived with him, eaten with him, slept with him, all while being a complete stranger, a killer. "How can I believe you?" he asked, the question full of his own broken heart. "Because if I'd wanted you dead, Ezra, you would be dead," she said, her voice low and certain. "I cooked every meal you ate for 2 years. I poured every drink. I had 1,000 opportunities. 1,000,000. Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I put away my poisons, Ezra. I threw away my plans for you. I tried so hard. I tried to just be her, to be Mary Blackwood, the woman you thought I was." "Time's up," Marshal Henderson announced, his voice like gravel as he approached them, the iron shackles dangling from his hand. Kate rose slowly, wiping the tears from her face with the back of her hand. She looked at Ezra, her expression a mixture of love and despair. "There's something else," she said quickly, her voice urgent. "In the bedroom, under the loose floorboard by the window, there's a tin box. It has money in it. A lot of money. All the money from before. It's yours now, Ezra. Take it. Use it to rebuild your life, to forget me." Henderson stepped forward and took her arm. "Catherine Morrison, you're under arrest." As the cold, heavy metal of the shackles closed around her wrists, Kate looked back at Ezra one last time. Her face was a portrait of heartbreak. "I love you," she said, her voice clear and strong, for only him to hear. "That's the one truth I can give you, Ezra. Everything else was a lie, but not that. Never that." Then they were gone. The sound of the horses' hooves faded into the vast, indifferent silence of the desert, leaving Ezra Blackwood utterly alone on his porch, his entire world shattered into 1,000,000 unrecognizable pieces. He sat on those steps for what felt like an eternity, just staring out at the empty horizon where they had disappeared with his wife. His wife. The words were a mockery now. They tasted like ash in his mouth. Mary Blackwood had never really existed, and Catherine Morrison, the woman who had taken her place, was a monster. Or was she? As the sun began to dip below the western mountains, painting the sky in fiery colors, Ezra finally found the strength to move. He walked through the house like a ghost, a stranger in his own home. Every object was now tainted by the truth. The curtains she had sewn, the books she had read to him in her gentle voice, the kitchen where she had created meals that were acts of love, or were they acts of deception? He went to their bedroom. He found the loose floorboard right where she said it would be. He pried it up, and there it was, a small tin box. He lifted it out. It was heavy. With trembling hands, he opened the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were stacks and stacks of bills. More money than he had ever seen in his life. More money than he could earn in 10 lifetimes of breaking his back on this ranch. Blood money, every dollar earned through murder and deceit. He closed the lid with a snap. He couldn't touch it. He couldn't use it. It was poison. But as he set the box aside, he found he couldn't bring himself to destroy it either. It was the last piece of her, the last piece of the lie he had loved. That night, for the first time in 2 years, Ezra lay alone in their bed. He stared up at the dark ceiling, and every single memory he had of their life together paraded through his mind, each one now twisted and suspect. Had she ever truly loved him? Or was that just the most convincing lie of all? When she held him, when she kissed him, when she laughed at his foolish jokes, had any of it been real? The most terrible part, the part that clawed at his insides, was that despite everything, he still loved her. He hated her. He was terrified of her, but he still loved the woman she had pretended to be, the woman who had made him breakfast just that morning, who hummed while she did the laundry, who had shared his dreams for the future. That woman had been real to him. even if her name and her past were nothing but a carefully constructed fiction. But as he lay there, a new, chilling thought entered his mind. She said she put away her poisons. She said she threw away her plans. But what if she was lying about that too? What if she was just waiting, biding her time for the perfect moment? What if Marshal Henderson hadn't shown up? Would he have woken up one morning? Or would he have just not woken up at all? The question would haunt him for the rest of his days. 6 weeks later, Ezra found himself in a crowded courtroom in Phoenix. The air was thick with sweat and the murmur of morbid curiosity. He had been called to testify at the trial of Catherine Black Widow Kate Morrison. The newspapers had feasted on the story like vultures on a carcass. The headlines were sensational, lurid. They screamed about the siren of death and the deceptive demoness who had fooled a simple, honest rancher. They painted him as a fool, a dupe, an object of pity and scorn. Kate sat at the defendant's table. She wore a plain gray dress, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She looked smaller than he remembered, diminished by the cold reality of the courtroom. When her eyes met his across the sea of faces, he saw a flicker of the woman he knew, the vulnerable, human, frightened woman who had read poetry to him on the porch. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor said, his voice sharp. "Ezra Blackwood." "And how do you know the defendant, Mr. Blackwood?" Ezra's throat felt like it was full of desert sand. He swallowed hard. "She was my wife," he said, the words heavy and bitter. I thought she was my wife." The prosecutor, a thin, weaselly man named Hartwell, led Ezra through the story. How Mary Sullivan had arrived at his ranch, how they had fallen in love, or so he thought, how they had married and lived together for 2 years before the law finally caught up with her. "And in all that time, Mr. Blackwood," Hartwell asked, his voice dripping with theatrical disbelief, "did you have any suspicion that the woman calling herself Mary Sullivan was, in fact, the notorious Black Widow, Kate?" "No, sir," Ezra said honestly. "None at all." "Did she ever act suspiciously? Did she ever display any unusual knowledge of, say, poisons or weapons?" Ezra thought of the small pistol she kept hidden. He thought of her uncanny calm when she'd shot that rattlesnake. He thought of her freezing at the sound of approaching riders. "She was careful," he said, choosing his words slowly. "Cautious. But I just thought that was because she'd been traveling alone. A lot of folks who come out west are running from something." "But you never suspected she was running from multiple murder charges?" Hartwell pressed, his voice sharp as a razor. "No, sir." The prosecutor continued his questions, relentlessly painting a picture of Kate as a cold, calculating predator and Ezra as her hapless, love-struck victim. It was a humiliating, painful experience. But then, it was the turn of Kate's lawyer, a young, earnest man named Morrison, no relation, who seemed determined to fight a hopeless battle. His questions were different. They weren't about the crimes. They were about the life they had shared. "Mr. Blackwood," Morrison began, his voice calm and respectful, "in the 2 years you were married to my client, did she ever, at any time, attempt to harm you?" "No." "Did she ever threaten you in any way?" "No." "She cooked all your meals, is that correct?" "Yes." "So, she would have had ample opportunity to poison you, as the prosecution alleges she did to her other husbands if that had been her intention." Ezra hesitated. The whole courtroom seemed to be holding its breath. "Yes," he admitted quietly. "She had the opportunity." "But she didn't take it, did she?" "No," Ezra said, "she didn't." Then came the final question, the one that cut right to the heart of the matter. "In your opinion, Mr. Blackwood, did Catherine Morrison love you?" The courtroom fell utterly silent. Every eye was on him. He could feel their stares, their judgment, their morbid fascination. He looked over at Kate. She was watching him, her face pale, her green eyes wide with a desperate, silent plea. What was the truth? Was her love the biggest lie of all, or the only truth she had left? He thought of her tears on the porch. He thought of her voice when she'd said his name. "Yes," he said, his voice quiet but firm, ringing with a conviction that surprised even himself. "I believe she did." The trial lasted for 3 long days. Witness after witness took the stand, building a mountain of evidence against Kate. They spoke of her previous marriages, of the mysterious and convenient deaths of her husbands. They detailed the pattern of inheritance and disappearance. The evidence was damning, overwhelming. The prosecution proved there was arsenic in the system of her first husband, Thomas Brennan. They presented evidence of the suspicious circumstances surrounding the sudden, violent food poisoning that had killed James Hartley. They laid out the so-called accidents that had befallen David Crenshaw and Robert Kellerman, accidents from which Kate had profited handsomely. But Kate's lawyer, Mr. Morrison, fought back with a surprising ferocity. He introduced a new, shocking narrative. He brought forth evidence that some of the men Kate had killed were not just bad men in a general sense. They were criminals themselves. He produced a wanted poster for David Crenshaw, showing he was a known highwayman and robber. He entered into evidence a report from a sheriff in Colorado stating that Robert Kellerman had been under active investigation for the assault and disappearance of 2 young women. "My client is not the cold-blooded monster the prosecution wants you to believe she is," Morrison declared in his closing argument, his voice ringing with passion. "She is a woman who, from the age of 16, was preyed upon by violent, evil men. She is a woman who learned to fight back in the only way she could. Yes, she took their lives, but they would have taken hers, or her dignity, or her freedom. In a world where the law offers little protection for women against the brutality of men, Catherine Morrison found her own way to survive. She was not a predator. She was the prey that learned to bite back." The prosecutor scoffed at this defense. He stood before the jury, his face a mask of contempt. Survival or profit? Catherine Morrison is a calculating killer who used her feminine wiles to lure men to their doom. She is a black widow spider, spinning a web of seduction and death. The fact that she spared 1 man, the lovesick Mr. Blackwood, does not erase the murders of 4 others. Do not be swayed by this desperate attempt to paint a monster as a victim. Find her guilty. Find her guilty of all charges. The jury was out for only 2 hours. When they filed back into the courtroom, their faces were grim and set. Ezra's heart pounded in his chest like a drum. Kate stood to hear the verdict, her back ramrod straight, her head held high. "On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of Thomas Brennan," the foreman read, his voice flat and unemotional, "we, the jury, find the defendant guilty." Kate's shoulders sagged, just slightly. It was the only sign of emotion she showed. "On the charge of murder in the first degree in the death of James Hartley, we find the defendant guilty." The word echoed through the courtroom, again and again. Guilty, 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 guilty on 4 counts of first-degree murder. In the Arizona Territory in 1887, there was only 1 sentence for that: death by hanging. As the judge read the sentence, his voice droning on, Kate finally turned and looked directly at Ezra. Her eyes were dry, but he could see the terror hiding deep beneath her composed facade, and he saw the profound sorrow. She mouthed 2 words to him across the crowded room, 2 words that hit him harder than any physical blow. "I'm sorry." The execution was scheduled to take place in 3 weeks. Ezra returned to his ranch, but it was no longer a home. It was a tomb, haunted by the ghost of a life that had never been real. The silence was deafening. The emptiness was a physical presence. He was trapped in a daze of grief and confusion. Who was the woman he had mourned? The gentle Mary Blackwood, or the vengeful Kate Morrison? Was there a difference? 2 days before the scheduled hanging, he made a decision. He rode his horse all the way to Phoenix. He had to see her one last time. He requested a visit with the condemned woman. They led him down a dark, damp corridor to her cell. She was chained, her wrists and ankles bound in heavy iron. She looked impossibly thin, her face gaunt, the vibrant life in her eyes dimmed by fear and resignation. But when she saw him standing there, a small, sad smile touched her lips. "I didn't think you'd come," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. They sat on opposite sides of the cold iron bars, separated by a wall of steel and a mountain of betrayal. "I had to," Ezra said. I still have questions." "Ask them," she said. "Was any of it real?" he asked, the question that had been tormenting him for weeks. "The woman I married, the life we built on the ranch, the laughter, the quiet nights. Was any of it real?" Kate was quiet for a long time, her gaze distant. "The first few weeks were a lie," she said finally, her voice heavy with regret. "I won't deny that. I came to your ranch with a plan. Seduce you, marry you, and kill you, just like the others." Ezra flinched, the words a fresh wound. "But then," she continued, her eyes meeting his, "then I got to know you. And I couldn't do it. I just couldn't." "When?" he asked, his voice raw. "When did it change?" A faint, bittersweet smile played on her lips. "Do you remember that night I got sick? About a month after I first arrived. I had a terrible fever. I was delirious." Ezra remembered. He'd been terrified. She'd been burning up, calling out strange names in her sleep. He had sat up with her all night long, changing the cool cloths on her forehead, forcing sips of water between her cracked lips. "You could have done anything to me that night," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was helpless, completely vulnerable. Any other man I'd ever known would have taken advantage. But you just took care of me. You were so gentle, so kind. No man had ever shown me that kind of tenderness without wanting something in return." She looked at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "That was the night. That's when I knew. I knew I could never, ever hurt you, Ezra Blackwood." "But you didn't tell me the truth," he said, the accusation soft, full of pain. "How could I?" she cried, her voice cracking. "What was I supposed to say?" "Hello, husband. By the way, my real name is Kate, and I'm a murderer who was planning to kill you for your ranch. But I've had a change of heart. Would you have believed me? Would you have let me stay?" She shook her head sadly. "I was a coward. I thought if I could just be Mary Blackwood, if I could bury Kate Morrison so deep that no one would ever find her, that maybe we could just be happy." "We were happy," Ezra admitted, the words torn from his soul. "At least I was." "Oh, Ezra," she whispered. "So was I. For the first time in my entire miserable life, I was happy." They talked for what felt like hours, reliving the 2 years they'd had. The good memories, the quiet moments, the shared dreams. It was a conversation drenched in pain, but also in a strange, cleansing honesty. A final, heartbreaking farewell between a husband and a wife. "Ezra," she said, as the guard came to announce that visiting time was over. Her voice was urgent. "I need you to know something. I never took your name lightly. I cherished it. For 2 wonderful years, I really was Mary Blackwood. That woman wasn't a lie. Her past was invented, her name was borrowed, but her heart was real. And she loved you. She loved you completely." "I know," Ezra said, his own voice thick with emotion. He reached through the bars, and this time he took her hand. Her skin was cold. "I love her too." On the morning of the execution, Ezra stood in the crowd that had gathered in Phoenix's town square. He had told himself he wouldn't come. Kate had asked him not to watch, but he couldn't stay away. He felt he owed her that much, to be a witness, to be there at the end. When they led her to the gallows, A collective gasp went through the crowd. She wasn't wearing the gray prison dress. She was wearing the simple green dress she had worn on their wedding day. The bitter irony of it twisted in Ezra's gut like a knife. She had chosen to die not as Catherine Morrison, the killer, but as Mary Blackwood, the wife. The preacher offered her a chance for a few final words. Kate's eyes scanned the crowd, searching until they found his. She looked right at him, and when she spoke, her voice was clear and steady, carrying over the hushed whispers of the onlookers. "I am sorry for the lies," she said, her voice ringing with a powerful, heartbreaking sincerity. "But I am not sorry for loving you, Ezra Blackwood. That was the only true thing I ever did in my life." The executioner placed the black hood over her head. The noose was fitted around her neck. Ezra closed his eyes. He couldn't watch. He heard a sickening thud, a collective gasp from the crowd, and then silence. When he opened his eyes again, it was over. The woman he had loved, the woman of secrets and contradictions, of poison and poetry, was gone. The crowd began to disperse, their morbid curiosity satisfied, muttering amongst themselves. But Ezra remained rooted to the spot, staring up at the empty gallows, a hollow ache in his chest, so vast it felt like it might swallow him whole. A gentle hand touched his shoulder. "Mr. Blackwood." He turned. Standing beside him was a young woman, maybe 20 years old. She had familiar brown hair and the same startlingly green eyes. It was like looking at a ghost. "I'm sorry to bother you at a time like this," she said, her voice soft and trembling. "My name is Rebecca Morrison. Kate. Catherine was my sister." Ezra stared at her, stunned into silence. A sister? Kate had never mentioned a sister. "She didn't like to talk about us," Rebecca said, as if reading his mind. "Our childhood, it wasn't a pleasant one. Our father." She trailed off, her eyes dark with old pain. "But I wanted you to know, Kate. She wrote to me. She wrote about you." Rebecca looked up at him, her green eyes, so like her sister's, swimming with tears. "In her letters, she called you the best man she had ever known. She said you were kind and gentle. She said you made her want to be a better person than she was." "She was better," Ezra found himself saying, his voice hoarse. "At least, she was trying to be." Rebecca nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. She reached into her reticule and pulled out a sealed envelope. "She asked me to give this to you. She said to give it to you only if the worst happened." With hands that trembled uncontrollably, Ezra took the letter. Kate's familiar, elegant handwriting was on the front. "My dearest Ezra." He broke the seal and unfolded the single sheet of paper. "My dearest Ezra, if you are reading this, then you know the whole ugly truth about me, and I am most likely dead. I have so many things to be sorry for, but I want you to know with all my heart that the 2 years I spent as your wife were the only truly happy years of my life. You showed me what it meant to be loved without fear, to be cherished instead of used. I know I have no right to ask anything more of you, but I have one last selfish request. Please, do not let my sins poison the memory of our time together. What we had, Ezra, it was real. Even if it was built on a foundation of lies, our love was not a lie. Love is not diminished by the flaws and failures of the people who feel it. Use the money I left you. I know where it came from. I know it is tainted, but money itself is not evil, only the things people do to get it. Take that tainted money and wash it clean. Build something good with it. Start a family. Help your neighbors. Make the world a little bit better to balance out all the bad that I have done. And most importantly, please, do not blame yourself for loving me. I was never worthy of a love as pure as yours, but I treasured every single day of it. You made me believe, if only for a little while, that I could be the woman you thought I was, the woman I wanted to be, for you. All my love, always, Mary P.S. There is something else in the tin box, something I could never bring myself to tell you. Look under the false bottom. 6 years had passed. It was 1893. Ezra Blackwood stood on the porch of his expanded ranch house. It was bigger now, with a new wing and a fresh coat of paint. He watched as his 2 young sons chased each other across the lush green lawn, their laughter echoing in the evening air. He had used Kate's money. He had taken her blood money and, as she had asked, he had washed it clean. He bought more land, tripling the size of his ranch. He built a small schoolhouse for the children of his neighbors, hiring a proper teacher from back east. He established a fund in Tucson County, a fund for widows and orphans, for women left alone and destitute, women like Kate could have been. He had also remarried. A kind, gentle widow named Elizabeth, whose husband had been killed in a mining accident. She knew the whole story. He had told her everything about Mary, about Kate, about the trial and the hanging, and she had looked at him with her soft, understanding eyes and had married him anyway. Their love was different from what he had shared with Kate. It was quieter, calmer, a peaceful harbor after a devastating storm. But it was no less real, and he was grateful for it every day. After the execution, he had gone back to the tin box. He had found the small catch she'd written about and pried up the false bottom. Underneath, there was no more money. There was no treasure map, no list of other victims. There was something far more shocking. A photograph of a young woman who looked like a much younger, more innocent Kate, holding a tiny baby. And tucked beside it, a folded birth certificate. Kate, before she had become Black Widow Kate, before she had even met her first husband, had given birth to a child. A daughter. A daughter she had been forced to give up for adoption to a family heading to Kansas. The child's name on the certificate was Mary Catherine Brennan. It had taken him nearly a year, but Ezra had found her. He had tracked the family down. The little girl, now 5 years old, was living with them. When Ezra explained who he was and who her mother had been, the adoptive parents, good but poor people, had been willing to let him take her. They knew he could give her a better life. Mary Catherine, or Katie, as she preferred to be called, now lived with Ezra and Elizabeth. She was a bright, fiery little girl, with her mother's stubborn chin and her mother's startlingly green eyes. Sometimes, when Ezra watched Katie playing in the yard, he would see a flicker of Kate in her smile, or in the determined way she tilted her head when she was deep in thought. It was like having a small piece of his Mary Blackwood back in his life. The good part. The part that had been real and loving and true. The past could never be changed. Catherine Morrison had killed 4 men, and she had paid the ultimate price for her crimes. But in her tangled, tragic life, she had also loved deeply, and she had been loved in return. She had tried, in her own broken way, to become someone better. In the end, maybe that was the most any of us could hope for. As the sun set over the vast Arizona desert, painting the sky in breathtaking shades of gold and crimson, Ezra called his family inside for supper. He thought of Kate often, but the sharp, stabbing pain had long since faded, replaced by a softer, bittersweet ache. A memory of a complicated, broken woman who had taught him that love could blossom in the most unlikely of places, and that even in the shadow of terrible secrets, there could be truth. He would never know for sure if she would have eventually told him everything. He would never know if their marriage could have survived such a devastating revelation. But he chose to believe what she had written in her final letter. He chose to believe that their love had been real. In the dining room, Elizabeth was setting the table. Katie ran ahead, her happy laughter filling the house with a joy that had once seemed impossible. Ezra followed her, his heart full. He carried the lessons Kate had taught him, that people are always more complex than they appear, that love can be found in the darkest of corners, and that redemption is always possible, even if, sometimes, it comes too late. Outside, the desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, carrying with it the ghosts of the past and the promise of tomorrow. And somewhere in that wind, Ezra liked to imagine Mary Blackwood was finally at peace. If you enjoyed this story, do us a favor and hit that subscribe button, and don't forget to ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the strange and mysterious. We've got a lot more stories to tell.